Blackest view. Have you ever heard of the Meteor Man? Whispered the maintenance worker. His young trainee nodded, eyes widening. He had grown up in the city where the Meteor Man was an infamous and unavoidable urban legend. The trainee had first heard the tale around a campfire when he was 10. Since then, he had heard many different versions of the story at sleepovers, high school football games, and while smoking cigarettes outside the mall. The story goes that the man had thrown himself off a building, but when he arrived at the ground, it appeared like he had fallen from somewhere much higher than a building. People say it looked like he had fallen from somewhere in the outer atmosphere, as his body arrived to the street completely incinerated, even though he was never on fire. A knowing grin emerged above the maintenance worker's chin. He leaned back in his office chair, savoring the moment of anticipation before his treasured reveal. Well, I met the man. Only days before he plummeted to the street, in fact. The maintenance worker pantomimed the scene with his right hand as he talked, index and middle finger acting as the Meteor Man, jumping off an invisible building to inevitably splat on the desk that separated the two men. This is the building he fell from, he said, pausing afterwards for effect, and he didn't jump off the top. Psycho broke through his own window, dropping 30 stories from his own apartment. The storyteller took a large gulp of lukewarm coffee. He looked down at the remaining liquid, which reminded him of his favorite part of the story, the part that only him and a few other people were aware of. No one ever mentions blackness neither. The trainee leaned in, captivated. What do you mean? Blackness. Nathan really believed he had accumulated everything. Like a prison warden leering down from the ramparts, he watched the laypeople, his metaphorical inmates, traverse the eroding city streets. Through the body-length window in his 30th story high-rise bedroom, financial circumstances incarcerated them. He was wealthy, liberated and free. Through his affluence, his ungodly excess, he had severed those ties that bind. His perception of superiority was intoxicating. No dark brandy, nor sexual enterprising, nor synthetically perfected opioid could match the feeling that came with that perception. To Nathan, they did not even come close. The strongest cocaine that money could buy barely even registered as pleasurable when compared to the inebriation of perceived supremacy. The white powder was a sickly red-yellow flicker of an old match, consumed and assimilated in an instant by the roaring draconic inferno that was his ascendance from the common man. Alone in his newly purchased multi-million-dollar penthouse, he felt comfortable and sated. The elevation from the dregs of society made him safe, he mused. Laypeople were cannibals, maybe not literally, but a desperate need forced them to tear each other limb from limb on a regular basis. The physical distance was a necessary security measure for a man of his financial stature. His life is perfect, the old man thought, although he still felt a little hollow. But to Nathan, that was just his killer instinct, his boundless ambition to climb one more rung up the societal ladder. If he didn't feel a little hollow, what would drive himself to accumulate more? He would get up every morning at 7 and start his routine by moving to view the city streets from his bedroom. The window he did this from was ostentatiously large, sleek and stainless. It was the wall that separated Nathan from the outside atmosphere running the length of the floor and all the way up to the ceiling. From his lonely perch, he would observe the people beneath him daydreaming that they were ants wriggling and squirming futilely beneath the shadow of his waiting foot. Sometime later, his morning vigil would be expectantly interrupted by a call. His driver letting Nathan know that he had arrived in the garage 30 floors below him. He would take one last long look, basking in his rapturous elevation before leaving for the day. As he approached sea level in the elevator, Nathan routinely experienced a sort of withdrawal. He would yearn to return to his spire mere moments after leaving it. The old man hated the space between his apartment and the car because of what it revealed to him. He felt powerful and vital when he was in his penthouse impossibly high above the city and its people. He felt identically powerful and vital when he was masquerading as one of the partners at his law firm, which began the moment he entered the company car with his chauffeur. In the brief space between those places, however, he could feel the actual hideous truth, and it made him helpless and brittle. As that truth took hold, Nathan would experience a rush of primal nausea, followed by his palms becoming damp with sweat. It was a byproduct of the reality that he did his absolute damnedest to ignore. The reality that he was nothing and he had nothing. Thankfully, navigating that existential space was less than 1% of his day. In the grand scheme of things, it was negligible and manageable. As soon as he was away from that truth, he'd push it as far back into his brainstem as it would go. The old man would have continued like this indefinitely had the view from his high-rise not been obscured by an inky black veil, an unexplainable tenebrous curtain that fell over his window to the sounds of an inaudible and otherworldly standing ovation from a place beyond perception. And it marked the coming end of Nathan's brief and forgettable stage play. When his digital alarm sounded that fateful morning, Nathan awoke utterly disorientated. His 1,600 square foot master bedroom was unexplainably sunless. The old man widened and squinted his eyes, trying to adjust to his lightless surroundings, but to no avail. Nathan could appreciate the faint glow of the light coming from the hall that led to his kitchen, in the top left-hand corner of his vision. But otherwise, the room was pitch black. He sat upright in bed, motionless, struggling to compute the change. For obvious reasons, he never had his bedroom window shades drawn, not wanting to block his view of the surfs below. He had contemplated removing the shades entirely, but was ultimately too lazy to do it himself. Nathan began troubleshooting the possibilities. What if a storm had rolled in? It felt unlikely. Even if the cityscape was enveloped by some exceedingly dense overcast, the millions of small urban lights would have provided some illumination. Like a glimmering swarm of fireflies breaking through a moonless night, he considered the possibility that the city's power grid had gone haywire, and it was still the middle of the night, despite what his alarm clock read. But the entire city without power, that felt impossible. Moreover, if everyone was without electricity, what light could he faintly appreciate coming from his kitchen? The only explanation he had left was that he was in a vivid, if not exceptionally odd dream. So Nathan sat and impatiently waited for this dream to abate. An excruciating 45 seconds passed without such luck. Unsure of what else to do, he blindly fumbled to locate his cell phone plugged in across the room, swearing and cursing at the Almighty and the universe for these new and unfair phantasmagoric circumstances. After some slapstick trips and falls appreciated by no one, he found his phone and activated the flashlight. Carefully, he used the makeshift lantern to guide himself out into his kitchen. With compounding befuddlement, Nathan found his kitchen bathed in the rising sun's light, the same as every other day. Standing at the end of the hallway that connects the two rooms, his disorientated state glued him to the wood tiling. He swiveled his head toward the void that used to be his bedroom, then back to the normal-appearing kitchen, back to the void, and so on, a dozen times. This repetitive, cartoonish appraisal failed to illuminate Nathan, and was another comedic beat that unfortunately went unappreciated. He decided the next best course of action was to involve the complex's concierge in the troubleshooting. At the very least, they would serve as a punching bag to direct his confused rage toward that day's concierge, was thoroughly desensitized to the inane tantrums of the obscenely wealthy. But this complaint surpassed petty disapproval. It was downright absurd. Finally, there was someone to appreciate the comedy of the situation. "Your window is malfunctioning, sir." A maintenance worker made his way up to the 30th floor high-rise. He had dropped what he was doing to attend to Nathan's outlandish complaint, but was still met with righteous indignation when he opened the door because of the perceived delay in arrival. No response would have been quick enough for Nathan. However, even if the worker had teleported to his front door, the old man would still have been frustrated that the worker didn't have the courtesy to teleport inside his condominium, saving this apparently important man valuable time by eliminating the need to answer the door. Nathan led the worker to his bedroom and outstretched his arm, placing his hand palm up in the darkness's direction. It was a gesture meant to imply the darkness was somehow the worker's fault, while simultaneously asking what he intended to do to fix it. The worker looked at the bedroom, then back at Mr. Southering quizzically. Nathan petulantly doubled down on his previous gesticulation, re-performing it with more gusto and vigor. Rather than wasting his words on a blue-collar man, the worker then scanned the area for signs of alcoholism, drug abuse, or mental illness. When he did not find any liquor bottles, hypodermic needles, or empty pill bottles, implying that the old man had missed a refill of something important, he decided his only course of action was to inspect the malfunctioning window. He made his way into the bedroom and towards the problem. Seeing that he had the young trainee spellbound, the maintenance worker's grin found enough real estate to somehow grow even larger. He downed the rest of his coffee, winked, and then resumed. "Yeah." The crotchety old coot couldn't see the inside of his bedroom, could see everything else just fine, though I could tell he was freaking out. I mean, I understand why. It made no earthly sense. If there was something physically wrong with him, all of his vision should have been affected, but it was just his bedroom. Said it was pitch black, like the whole damn thing was enveloped by some kind of fog that only he could see. The young trainee was stunned, awestruck, even. It was like meeting a celebrity's cousin, someone close enough to have inside information, but still far enough removed to not know the whole story, keeping the mystique intact. I only saw him one time after that. Or rather, I heard him howling like a banshee. The night before, he became the Meteor Man. To Nathan, it looked like the worker was swallowed whole by the miasma of his bedroom. Once again, he was dumbstruck. Nathan grabbed his phone, pointed the flashlight into the darkness of the bedroom, and cautiously entered behind the man. The old man watched as the worker navigated the room without question or concern. He stepped over loose items of clothing on the floor and avoided stubbing his toe on the oversized bed frame that held Nathan's king-size bed. Nathan stood at the edge of the darkness, watching him perform these feats without the help of any auxiliary illumination. The phone flashlight he held could not penetrate entirely through the ink that filled the volume of his bedroom from where he was standing, making the worker intermittently disappear and reappear from the blackness. It was like he was spelunking deep within the earth, only to find the worker was some subterranean humanoid who had only ever known darkness, granting him the ability to attend to his duties with no need for light. Eventually, unsure of how to proceed, the worker returned to the bedroom entrance where Nathan stood petrified by confusion. The sight of the old man confounded and afraid of seemingly nothing holding a phone light forward into a room that was already damn bright from the morning sun did manage to spark some pity in him. "Do you need me to call you an ambulance, buddy?" Of course, this only re-invoked the old man's rage. While in the middle of an unfocused tirade, his phone vibrated, causing Nathan to throw it to the ground and jump back as if it had spontaneously metamorphosed into a tarantula. His driver was calling. He had arrived in the garage. Nathan promptly kicked the worker out of his home, trying to let wrath mask his embarrassment over the situation. He threw on a suit and tie, finding the clothes using a large flashlight he procured from a cupboard. As he was walking out the door, he had an idea. Nathan returned to his apartment, stuffing a pair of binoculars into his briefcase before leaving for the day. Instead of going to the garage, he went to the city sidewalk that faced his penthouse. Through his binoculars, he slowly counted floors to his apartment complex until he hit 30. From the outside, he could see into his apartment, recognizing his wardrobe and other furniture visible through the windows. Nathan gasped, letting the binoculars tumble to the ground. Why could he not appreciate the darkness from the outside? Dazed by the morning's events, he sleepwalked into the company car, hoping this all represented a transient stroke or unexplainable optical illusion. When he arrived home that evening to find deathly blackness still oozing from his bedroom, he had to face the reality that this phenomenon was neither a stroke nor an illusion. For the first few days, the old man mitigated the unbridled existential terror by filling the catacomb that used to be his bedroom with various electrical light sources. Each light source in isolation was much too weak to cut through the haze. Nathan required an absolute military cavalcade of fluorescence to stand a chance of fully seeing his bedroom. With his lights set up and on, he tried to sleep, but it was a futile effort. After about an hour, like clockwork, the light bulbs in his bedroom would explode no matter the source that housed them. Unable to relax without every corner of his bedroom illuminated and constantly awakened by the tiny implosions, he laid his head on the sofa, farthest from his bedroom. The entrance of the bedroom was thankfully still visible for monitoring from the sofa. This change in tactics afforded him a few minutes of shut-eye, but only a few. He had run out of spare light bulbs by the time he had migrated to the sofa. To Nathan's distress, he was forced to give up on pushing back the oppressive darkness. He constantly opened his eyes to ensure the ink was not spreading, vigilant as well for signs of movement that could represent a malicious entity emerging from somewhere in that tomb. The ink did not spread, and no phantoms were ever born from the darkness. Despite this good fortune night after night, Nathan got less and less sleep. Although nothing appeared out of the darkness, something eventually manifested from inside of it, and it turned his blood to ice. Abruptly and unceremoniously, a noise began to emanate from his bedroom. Short bursts of rhythmic tapping, the unmistakable sound of knuckles rapping on glass. The horrifically familiar reverberations of human knocking. At first, hours passed between instances of the knocking. Nathan tried to convince himself it was just sleep deprivation, playing tricks on his aching psyche. But what was at first an hour's reprieve from the uncanny disturbance, then became only minutes. And what was initially the sound of one hand knocking on glass eventually became 2, then 5. And then the noise was so chaotic that Nathan was unable to discern how many knocks were overlapping with each other. At wit's end, Nathan arrived at a sort of tormented frenzy that almost could be mistaken for courage. He jumped up from the sofa and descended into his bedroom, turning on the kitchen light en route and wielding only his phone for protection. When he entered, he could tell that the knocking was coming from directly outside his bedroom window. As he approached the window, however, the knocking slowed, stopping completely when he was a few feet from it. Directing his phone light at the glass, he could only see darkness outside the window, simultaneously framing a faint silhouette of himself reflecting off the inside surface. Nathan then stood statuesque in the black silence, unsure of how to proceed, when the bulb in his phone erupted into sparks. In a fraction of a second, the miasma subsumed him. The heat from the explosion burnt the palm of his right hand, causing him to throw the phone somewhere unseen into the mire that used to be his bedroom. Compared to before, he could no longer orient himself to his position in the bedroom by the gleam of the kitchen light. He simply could not see it. He couldn't see anything. Nathan desperately tried to find the way out, but without light, the size of his bedroom had become seemingly infinite. He started by walking carefully in the direction opposite to where he thought the window was, but after a few steps, a sharp pain like a cat bite inflamed his right ankle, bringing him to his knees with a yelp. Now crawling, he kept moving away from the window. He did not pivot to the right or left, yet he never encountered a wall or the hallway. No matter how far he went, Nathan believed he had been pulling himself forward for hours. The carpet began to feel wet and sticky with an odorless substance. As he kept moving, the carpet then seemed to transition into grass and soil. When a flare of madness overtook Nathan, he attempted to pull what he thought was grass out of the ground. Instead of the grass-like substance yielding from the soil, each piece stayed firmly tethered in place, while creating multiple lacerations into the flesh of Nathan's left palm. As he dragged it upwards, the sensation was as if he had forcefully run the inside of his hand along multiple razor blades. Nathan reflexively brought his hand to his mouth, tasting metallic blood as it leaked from him. Defeated, he curled into a ball and fell on his side, resigned to eventually starving in that position, rather than facing more of the abyss. As his head touched the floor, a familiar vibration and a dim light against his cheek startled him. He picked up his lost phone, finding it difficult to answer an incoming call because of the blood that had oozed onto the screen. Looking at his phone tinted crimson through his murky blood, he could discern that he had missed a call from his driver and that it was 8 in the morning. In abject horror, Nathan recalled looking at his phone before he foolishly entered the darkness, and it had read 6:45 a.m. He had been in his bedroom for only a little over an hour. Utilizing the dim light of the phone screen, Nathan attempted to determine where he was and how close he had been to making it out into the hallway. Instead, the light revealed his reflection in the window, staring back at him, indicating he had not moved anywhere at all. When he found his way out of the bedroom, turned schizophrenic nightmare, he fell to the floor of the hallway and sobbed. After he had no more tears to give, Nathan numbly examined himself, looking to evaluate his injuries. There was a tiny burn on his right hand from where his phone's exploding bulb had scorched it, but he did not see the gashes on his left palm. He did not see the blood on his phone. He felt his right ankle for evidence of the perceived cat bite, but he found only smooth, intact skin. In a raving panic, he determined he was most likely insane from a brain tumor and needed a physician. The next step in that plan would be to go to the garage and find his driver, who would then deliver him to the hospital. Nathan spilled out his front door, enjoying the welcome relief of his escape, though this was cut short by the resumed sound of knocking on glass. He turned his body in the doorway to face the obsidian depths of his bedroom and its incessant knocking, and then he screamed into it out of fear, exhaustion, and anger. When he stopped, things were briefly silent, and Nathan felt a shred of pride rise in his chest as he earnestly believed that he had managed to strike back and injure a fathomless void. After a moment, another scream broke the quiet, exactly identical to Nathan's, but it was not coming from him. It was coming from his bedroom, twice as loud as before. He turned to sprint towards the elevator, but the knocking resumed with a heightened ferocity. The old man assumed that creating distance from the window from the sound would dampen the hellish drumming in accordance with natural law. As he created space from the window, however, the knocking only grew more deafening in his ears. When he reached the elevator threshold, the noise was like helicopter blades thrumming inches from his head. Nathan wanted to escape, but he knew implicitly that the only time the knocking had ceased was when he was next to the window. Despite this, he pushed forward and entered the elevator, managing to press the button for the garage. He had only reached the 27th floor when the cacophony became unbearable, like his skull was perpetually splintering into thousands of fragments from the pressure the sound created in his mind. But his brain did not have the mercy to implode alongside the pain and actually kill him. He wildly hammered the open door button and ran the 3 flights of stairs back up to the 30th floor, down the hallway and back into his penthouse. So picture this. The maintenance worker said, suppressing a smoker's cough as he did, "I'm working on the 26th floor minding my own business when I determine some electrical issue is actually originating 1 floor below. So I walk over to the stairwell, and when I open the door, I hear some lunatic screaming nonsense from a floor or 2 above. I didn't see the guy, so I don't know for certain. But it sure as shit sounded like the Meteor Man." The trainee broke through his amazement long enough to ask a follow-up question. "Do you remember what he was screaming about?" The maintenance worker contemplated the question. No one in recent memory had asked him about the contents of the Meteor Man's ravings, so he had to dig deep to try to recall what he said. Something about an Elise. He was asking her to stop knocking and that he was sorry. Whatever all that means, with all sense of self-preservation erased and overwritten by the need for the knocking to abate, Nathan rocketed headfirst into the miasma of his bedroom. Guided by the dim light of his phone screen, he located where he stood before, but the knocking did not cease this time. He moved a few steps closer, but still the knocking did not cease. With no more space between himself and the window, he pressed his face against the glass, looking to where the street should be, and the knocking finally lifted and dissolved into the ether. The relief again was short-lived. With his eyes directed downward, he saw the sidewalk adjacent to his building framed and isolated from the rest of the city by a familiar blackness. An enormous gathering of people gazed up singularly at Nathan, elbow to elbow and unmoving, but they were grotesquely malformed. The people below Nathan had bulbous heads sporting inhuman features. Their eyes dominated the top of their faces, and their mouths dominated the bottom of their faces, and there was barely any visible skin to demarcate the 2 characteristics. Their mouths were that of a lamprey's gaping and circular asymmetric teeth littering the cavity. Their eyes were compound and honeycombed like that of a fly or a praying mantis. Thousands of these abominations all stared up at Nathan, waiting. Finally, a chime sounded from an unknown location, and one of their numbers was lifted above the crowd onto their shoulders. The myriad slowly turned away from Nathan and towards the chosen one, and in horrific synchrony, they descended on that chosen one and viciously severed them into innumerable fleshy pieces. The creatures close enough to the carnage greedily filled their gullets with the remains. They inserted meat into their cavernous mouths, but they would not chew. Instead, the circles of teeth would spin and rotate, flaying and deconstructing the tissue until it could slide gently into their throats. The vision and the accompanying soundscape were mind-shattering, and Nathan drew his head back and closed his eyes. As soon as he did so, the knocking would resume at peak intensity, debilitating pressure finding home again in his skull. The pain would cause him to open his eyes and place his face against the glass, to once again bear witness to whatever infernal rite was occurring on the ground below. The horrors would gaze up at him patiently, awaiting another chime to sound and signal sacrifice. When it did, he would watch the bloodletting until he could no longer, and then the knocking would find purchase in him again. This surreal cycle continued with no signs of relenting until a divine visage pressed its hand against the glass of Nathan's window from the outside, amidst the hallucinogenic maelstrom. It took Nathan a few moments to recognize his ex-wife. Elise was somehow floating in the ether outside curly brown locks, swaying gingerly like wisps of air, and a familiar set of green eyes meeting his. The couple had met in law school when Nathan's psychopathy was in its infancy. Initially, Elise had pulled him back from the brink, from the point where he would need to divest his identity as collateral for the chance at wealth and power. A year after meeting each other, they were wed, and there were talks of starting a family. In a pivotal moment, however, Nathan internalized what starting a family would mean for him. Children meant hospital bills, exponential living costs, and college tuitions. It wouldn't bankrupt him, not by a long shot, but it would lead to his devolution into one of the people on the sidewalk. As a common man, he would be constantly looked down upon from a high rise by some other devil. Nathan realized he could not and would not tolerate that judgment. Out of the blue, and with Elise 2 months pregnant, Nathan filed for divorce. Having divested his soul, no amount of pleading, reasoning, or suffering would ever return him to humanity. To his dying day, he had no idea what had become of his wife or his child. Although the old man would never know the truth, it was this Elise had lived a long and difficult life. She raised a beautiful, hard-working daughter, but it had not been easy, and she had grown to resent her ex-husband with a white-hot, feverish intensity. Days before he became the Meteor Man, and minutes before the black mist arrived in Nathan's room, Elise passed away after a long fight with stomach cancer. In times of true duress, Nathan would still think of his ex-wife fondly, but only because the thought of her seemed to comfort and sedate him, not because he earnestly missed her. Elise reached out to him with her hand, as if to say she had heard his agony and had come to deliver him salvation. Her fingertips touched the window's glass from the outside, and Nathan tried to phase his hand through the barrier to accept her offer. Elise watched him struggling, pushing his hands on different areas of the window, as if there was some invisible hole in the wall between them, and he only needed to locate it to survive. Eventually, Elise showed mercy. She slid her right hand through the window effortlessly and placed it lovingly on Nathan's cheek. For a third and final time, his relief was short-lived. She snapped her hand from his cheek to the back of his head, grabbed a thick and sturdy tuft of hair, and drove his head into the window from the opposite side, partially caving in the front of his skull and splintering the window with 2 sickening twin cracks. She paused, and then drove his head into the window again. And a third time, and in a grand finale, she shattered the window and pulled him through, held him by the back of the head so he could view the people and the city street from above one last time, and then she dropped him into the waiting moor below. "Did you get to see the crime scene?" The young trainee asked. "No, I didn't. I don't go up to the 30th floor much either, not if I don't have to." The storyteller's mood had shifted from playful to somber. He looked away from the trainee as he wrapped up his part in the tale. "I don't know who Elise is, but sometimes I see the frame of a woman, featureless black mist, roaming the halls on the 30th floor. Whatever. The Meteor Man had in life. It's hers now, in death." And with that, he concluded the story, at least as he understood it. After Nathan had landed on the sidewalk, he was reduced to pulp and bone for all the passers-by, to see a final humiliation, to have it revealed in an outrageous spectacle that he was no god, that he was flesh just like everyone else. When the police entered his 30th story high-rise, they found no darkness within. All they saw was a broken window, a hammer in his bedroom that had been used to shatter the glass, and the spot where Nathan Southering threw himself onto the asphalt below. The one nagging feature the police could not explain, however, was the state of the body on its arrival to Earth. The old man's flesh had been seared and charcoaled almost beyond recognition, yet there was no sign of a fire in his apartment, nor on the city street that he fell onto. This phenomenon was never scientifically explained, and the old man had no one willing to posthumously investigate the mystery for him. After his curtain call, Nathan did manage to retain a minor thread of infamy, not as a demigod of wealth and power, but instead as the legend of the Meteor Man, a nameless individual who seemingly plummeted to Earth from an impossible height in the outer atmosphere, incinerating any and all trace of who he once was. And that legend still lives on.